Hello. I hope you can all see and hear us. Um, Díobh agus tá fáilte rud go léir go dtí áirisciúil na hÉireann tráthnóna Nollaig na mBan. Tásúla gom go bhfuil siad ag suí go compórdaach le cupán té nó fian agus piece of quiche de Nollaig. Good evening. I'm Betty Stenson, the Programming Officer at the Irish Writers' Centre, and I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of myself and for Nollaig na mBan 2021. We can't be at our usual venue, the wonderful Epic Museum, where we usually have an evening of singing, music, poetry and readings. But we're grateful for the gift of technology that we can at least meet for an hour, albeit remotely, with two wonderful writers who will be in discussion very shortly. So, Nollaig na mBan. People sometimes ask, what's the purpose of Nollaig na mBan? Well, 6th of January, the last of the 12 days of Christmas, is known variously as Women's Christmas, Little Christmas, and of course it's also the Feast of the Epiphany. In times past, Nollaig na mBan was supposed to be a day off from all house and farm work for the women who had toiled over the 12 days of Christmas. The traditional roles were reversed, with the men doing the women's duties in the home, while the women got the opportunity to make social calls to their friends, neighbours and family, where they had cups of tea and cake and, had the chat. If they'd been extra good, they might even manage to be allowed a glass of port in the snug of the local pub. Anyway, it has been asserted that the name Women's Christmas can be explained by the fact that Christmas Day was marked by whiskey and beef, men's fare, while on Little Christmas, the dainties preferred by women, cake, tea and wine, were more in evidence. Or it could be just the case that that's all that was left over on the 12th day of Christmas after all the festive fare had been finished. But things change, and hopefully for the better. But it's no wonder that sometimes people still ask, why do we continue to celebrate Nollaig na mBan? But it could be argued that it stems from a profoundly patriarchal past. Academic and historian Angela Burke suggests that modern Irish women now view the day as something akin to International Women's Day. Certainly the custom has been reinterpreted, and the day is now being marked around the country as a celebration of female friendship and achievements. It has been reclaimed and reframed as a salute to sisterhood. In that vein, we are honoured to be joined by writers Caelainn, Hogan and Nidhi Aria Eipe, who will be embracing the tradition of Nollaig na mBan by remotely visiting and discussing their own work and other works of modern women amid the landscape of women's literature today. We're looking forward to an hour of reading and conversation with these two acclaimed women. Just before I introduce Caelainn and Nidhi, I just want to invite you to join our annual Nollaig na mBan book swap. Simply post a picture of your work or the work of your favourite women writer to Instagram or Twitter. Tag us at Irish Writers' Centre and help us in sharing some great reading recommendations among our community of writers. Okay, hi Caelainn, you're welcome.
Hi Betty, thanks for having us.
I'm very happy to introduce Caelainn. I know her of old. Caelainn is a writer and journalist from Dublin. Her first book, Republic of Shame, caused seismic shifts in our perception of the ongoing legacy of Ireland's religious-run institutions. She has reported internationally for the New York Times magazine, National Geographic, The Guardian, Vice magazine, Al Jazeera, The Washington Post, and more. You're very welcome, Caelainn. And Nidhi Aria Eipe is a poet, pacifist, and fabulist. She is the founder of the Play It Forward Fellowship, poetry editor at Skene Press, and co-editor of Hold Open the Door, the Ireland Chair Poetry commemorative anthology. Her debut poetry collection is forthcoming with Favour in Favour in July 2021. You're very, very welcome, Nidhi. I'm going to speak in a minute, and I'm going to leave the two of you, with Caelainn leading the way, to chat together. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Betty, and thank you to the Irish Writers Centre for having us, and thanks to everyone for joining. I saw something pop up in the chat. Someone is joining us from Sicily, so it seems like we have people from all over the world, which is, I guess, the benefit of doing these sort of events remotely. It feels like a very long time since last year when we were celebrating Nollaig in the Epic Museum in Dublin. And it was an incredibly special night with a celebration of obstreperous women. I know that word came up quite a few times, but just a brilliant space to hear the voices of so many different women in Ireland who are creating work and exploring different forms of writing. And I think it has become this celebration of women. And I think it came up on the Irish Arts Centre page. There was this story about their sort of word of the day, which was, I'm probably going to mangle the word now, but aharach, which means, I think, transition or transformation. And it was a story about an abbot of Drimna way back in the day who found himself transformed into a woman. And I think, Nollaig na mBan, I think, was sort of centered on fairly those traditional roles of gender and the domestic labor that women were doing over Christmas, but has become an interesting space for transformation, for challenging those roles, for seeing them as a construct that can be sort of flipped and played with. So I think it's really exciting to see how Nollaig na mBan has become this very inclusionary celebration. So I'm thrilled to have everyone joining us today and really excited to talk to Nidhi about her work and this very strange year that we've all had. I think I'll start off with just asking Nidhi, what does Nollaig na mBan mean to you in this moment?
Thanks so much, Caelainn, and thanks everybody for joining us. It's really lovely to be here and to share this space with you in spirit, at least. So I hope you all have your feet up with some cake. I think for me, the importance of Nollaig na mBan, especially this year, is that it is a day of rest. I think rest is something that has been really hard to do in the past year for many reasons, and particularly in a time when we may not have had the chance to focus on our own well-being. I think it's really important to remember to be kind, first to ourselves and then to those around us, and maybe like a reminder to make room for the playful as well in our lives, because I think it's a little tricky, this necessity of working from home now when home has traditionally been the place of rest. And I think of something that Anne Carson mentioned once, where she said that the reason why we love things like festivals and reading is because it puts us outside of time. So we're in a suspended state. And when you're in a suspended state, there is a sort of unseriousness about it, there's room for fun. And I really love that idea of having, an occasion where you can sort of step out of your usual skin and maybe notice some of the patterns that you've made for yourself, and sometimes unknowingly. And I think sometimes these are not always serving us or nurturing us. And so it's an opportunity to build new ones as well. So yeah, I think that's sort of where I am with celebrations these days, because I know it can be really hard to feel that spirit in a time when things are actually really difficult on so many levels.
Definitely, and I think that's really interesting, the idea of work and home, and in a way Nollaig na mBan is this kind of interesting, freeing and sort of liminal space, when things are possible that aren't usually. But also it made me think, over Christmas, I was lucky enough to be home and with my mother, and we're actually making Christmas puddings, which these puddings that will last for years. You sort of feed them brandy and they ripen over years, and it's, you know, kind of her recipe that's passed down, and kind of the importance and the joy of that form of work. And it is a labor. I think in a way Nollaig na mBan acknowledges the labor that is done by women, that is done by not just women but by caretakers as well, people doing work that isn't seen or isn't appreciated or valued in the same way in our society, and it's acknowledging that work as work. And I think at this time, and through the pandemic, from the student nurses who aren't being paid to you know, the situations that sex workers have found themselves in with the pandemic, and you know, their rights coming, you know, being really important to acknowledge, different forms of work and care, and the forms of work that we don't value in our society, and yet we are now so dependent on because of the pandemic, and that inequality in how we value work. I think it's an interesting day to think about that, you know, as a day of rest, but rest from work that isn't often seen as work. So you know, this is all going on in my brain as I was thinking about this. So it is, yeah, it's I think a special time to come together and think about all the sort of unseen work that we do, and the need to take space and create space for ourselves. And I'm really interested to talk to you about, you know, being a poet in this time. I think poetry is something that has become a real source of consolation and sort of resilience for people throughout the pandemic. Seamus Heaney, from the US election to the pandemic, he's really you know, sort of become this source of insight. And I think just there today, I think Yeats got a look in as well. But you know, poetry has become a way for people to sort of, you know, steel themselves, but also to find an escape in a very chaotic and difficult time. But what is the process for you as a poet, and how has it been trying to write poetry during this time? I know that you have a new collection, your first collection coming out this year, and you're also contributing to an anthology called Plague Poems, which I'm fascinated to hear more about. So how has it been for you writing poetry at this time?
I think it's been a very private thing for me this year. I think as a writer, I often turn to writing in order to make sense of the world, in order to understand it. And in a time where it's very difficult to make sense of anything, when things are changing so rapidly, it's been almost a secret practice. But I feel like poetry, in its appeal to people, offers sort of conditions for hope that maybe are difficult to find through other ways. Because I think with poems, there isn't that sort of claim to certainty. You know, there's a sort of great unknowing, and there's a comfort in that. I think of poetry as an invitation into intimacy, usually where the boundary between you and I collapses, you know, at least temporarily. And in that space, something can emerge. I think there was an anthropologist and poet, Michel Lévy, and he used to say that the practice of poetry enables us to posit the other as an equal. I like to think of it like that, because I think that with writing, you are always sort of circling around the other, even if it's just the other in yourself, you know. And so for me, poetry has always been that sort of harking back to, it's almost mythological, you know, in a sense of what we come up with in our collective imaginations in order to derive some sort of comfort from the situations in which we find ourselves. And I think about something you said recently, where you were talking about this idea of giving voice, you know, to people who are often marginalized or silenced, and you said that you think that this idea is actually harmful because people who have been through those experiences have their own voices and they need to be heard, you know. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how we could, or how we might better hold space for each other and amplify each other's stories in situations like these.
Yeah, I mean, this is something while I was writing Republic of Shame that just felt really important to try and articulate. It's at the end of the book. It was something I wanted to express very explicitly because as a journalist, as a writer, particularly writing about people who've been displaced or experienced conflict, and now writing about the experiences of people who have been through the religious run institutions, who are survivors of those institutions, you often get told in a very well-meaning way a lot of the time, but you know, oh, you're giving a voice to these people. And it has always made me feel very, very uncomfortable because what I hope to do through my writing is to show the power of these people's voices, and to have these people's voices be heard, and to acknowledge their agency and respect their agency and their experiences, and to show how they are experts of their own experience, and how important it is for us to learn from people who have experienced these things firsthand. And so I think it's important to sort of change the way that we see that, to acknowledge that writing can be a way to create space and amplify voices of people who have been marginalized or silenced. But if we take away that agency, if we sort of assume that we are giving someone a narrative or giving someone a voice, I think we are again silencing them in a different way. And so I think seeing that in a different way is really important. And you know, it's been a difficult year, and Christmas particularly can be a really difficult time for survivors, people who've been separated from their children, people born in the institutions who are still searching for information about their identity and about their origins. And so, you know, because it's just a time when family comes together, and it can be very painful and a very intense time of year. And I think we can all, with the pandemic, so many of us are missing people and have been separated from people that we really want to see. And so I hope there's a little more maybe understanding of that. But I think it's particularly important, you know, this being Christmas, but also in this new year now, and next week, we have the final report of the mother and baby homes, hopefully finally being released after many years. And so I think survivors are bracing themselves for the truth that hopefully will come out through that report. But they have been the people who have sort of forced that truth into the light, and often through a very painful experience of having to revisit trauma and revisit very painful moments of their life and ongoing trauma. And so I think respecting as well that it isn't always a cathartic experience to tell your story, and you know, people do it so that change can happen, and so that these injustices aren't repeated. So I think acknowledging it as well, the power of that, and the burden that is for people who have to revisit those experiences, and respecting that. I think that it is a very intense time of year, and I know that one of your poems in your new anthology or your new collection deals with sleep, and that is something that I think we've all struggled with. It's something that I've struggled with my whole life, so in a way I feel a little more normal during the pandemic. So I think, you know, writers and yeah, as a freelancer as well, we kind of have our own time frame and zone. So it's been interesting to see everyone else adjust to that. But I'd love to hear you read if you would do us the honor.
Absolutely, I will. Just building off what Caelainn said. So during the lockdowns, I witnessed a real shift in the way that I related to sleep and to time. And strangely, I felt my body sort of coming awake in a way, you know, becoming more alive and becoming sort of alert to these undercurrents that are, I think, more available to us at night. And I was drawn to explore more deeply the human relationship to time and death in different cultures over the ages. So I went back and looked at some myths and folklore from different parts of the world. And I wrote this poem after two Greek gods. So they're twins, Hypnos and his brother Thanatos. And they, according to the law, they live they're exiled to a cave where no light or sound ever reach them. And it's the cave from where the Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, begins. And so I wrote this poem in an attempt to sort of invite these exiled gods back into our pantheon and to honor like the place that they hold in our lives and to not lose sight of how important it is to keep that, you know, idea of how miraculous really time and its passage is for us, and to become aware of that more during the pandemic. So this is titled Sleep Melancholy. When it arrived, I could not. Sleep turned his face so far from me, and I called out. I dreamed him there in his darkened cave by the river of forgetting. I begged that calm and gentle God would find me, kiss my eyes shut with his hands, cover me with poppies. When it came, when it changed us and everything, we lost the lay of time and space, seemed elastic, shrinking into vastness. I thought of you then, how I would give half of my life for you, how you live where neither rays nor waves touch, you resting on blackened bark at twilight in bloom, stitched together from the shadows on your wrists. But sleep, melancholy, you are not alone, for death is always somebody's brother, constant youth with feather-light fingers, waltzing on the sea's broad back.
Thank you so much for that, Nidhi. It's beautiful. And it is a salve. Like I felt myself just physically sort of have space, you know, in that moment. I think it's really, really powerful. But I think the pandemic has sort of forced us to slow down in a way and reflect. We've had time, more time than usual, some of us, but also to think about, I think, the power of our traditions and our communities, the solidarity, there's sort of a new appreciation for that, I think. And just as you were reciting it, it made me think very early on in the pandemic, there was footage of, I think, one of the first funerals that were, you know, where people couldn't attend. And I think everyone came out and lined the streets of a small town in Ireland so that as the hearse made its way, to the church, and just such a powerful moment, how people have found ways to express their solidarity and to honor each other in new ways, despite the distance and despite all the challenges that we've faced.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much going on right now, and there's so much of that desire to, I think, participate in the, in empowering and the emancipation of others. And I suppose in that vein, I wondered, in your experience working with survivors, including in conflict and post-conflict regions, I've been thinking about how we can approach justice and reconciliation, particularly where I think, responsibility is almost forsworn in acts of injustice that are perpetuated by institutions or bodies of the state. And I wonder, I know you've been thinking about this so much as well, and I wonder if, there's a way that we can approach this that might be a bit more radical than the usual ways.
I think with there's been a lot of acknowledgement. I mean, even early on this year, we've had some year. I mean, we had this major election that was quite seismic, and then of course the pandemic. There's been so much change, and I think people are really looking for change that is more meaningful, that is more systemic, from the movements for racial justice to the acknowledgement of the very deep and systemic inequalities that have, caused so many deaths over the past year because of the pandemic, and the pandemic has sort of exposed them in a new way. And I think that is difficult to see the reality of that. I think for some people who might not have been aware of it, but it's important, I think, the conversations that are happening around systemic change and acknowledging that there are real sort of structural issues that we need to address. And I think it's important in the context of survivors' experiences, and I would never want to speak for them, but from what I've spoken to people about and sort of looking at how these institutions were normalized so easily, I think we do need to look into those systems. And as writers, that is something that I've actually seen increasingly writers sort of engaging with those conversations and exploring ideas around systemic change. And I think that we have to acknowledge the realities of systems that we're normalizing today, like direct provision. I think that has really come to light, or at least come into the public light more. It's so many years since I first wrote about direct provision, and it's really difficult to see that system, still operating. And I think there are so many parallels between how that is normalized, the institutionalization of vulnerable people, and how these are policies. We're seeing how deliberate political policies and decisions affect lives so deeply. And it's not a case of personal fallibility or chance. It is a result of political decisions. We're seeing that how, because it is such a global experience, we're seeing how the different political approaches are having ramifications, and how it is an issue of political will. And we saw that with the Repeal the Seal campaign recently, which was, came about because of a very distressing and difficult decision by the government to seal records from the investigation into mother and baby homes. But there was sort of an outpouring, a real public outcry about this, and I think a new sort of sense of solidarity. And I think that's because almost everyone in Ireland has been affected or knows someone affected by these institutions, where women were sent away for so many years, and the culture of secrecy and shame that system enforced and perpetuated. And the fact that that's an ongoing issue, that so many people's lives are still affected by that, and so many people are still searching for answers. It was a moment, even as distant as we all are, where people, even if it was just online, you know, sharing a picture or coming together, there was a solidarity there and an acknowledgement that if, you know, if the political will was there, things could change. And I think that is something that's come from this year, that people are moving away from that idea of, well, it is what it is, Trump's famous line, to thinking of a different future and how we can really look to make those deeper changes, because we're acknowledging how deep those inequalities are.
And I think just writing like yours does so much to shine a light on that, and you know, to bring that into people's awareness. And I was wondering if maybe you would read a little bit for us from Republic of Shame.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I chose this part. It's set in November, so it's close to Christmas and the New Year. But I decided to read it because there was an Irish Times piece. I think it was an opinion piece about how the work of the religious orders in quote unquote aiding single mothers in Ireland was not being acknowledged, and how people don't acknowledge the good work that the church did, or don't seek to hear those voices. And it was a woman who was speaking about how Catholic families took in women. You know, even as recently, I think it's the 80s, there was a religious agency called Ally that was set up by a Dominican priest in Dublin, and sort of had this network of families where these women would be sent. And the idea of this article was that, you know, we don't appreciate the good that was done, or the charity, the aid that was given to women. And I find that really, you know, a sort of difficult narrative that's being sort of put forth there, because, and I got that a lot writing the book. You know, well, what about the good that the church has done, or you're only hearing one side of the story. And I made a big effort with the book to speak with women within the religious orders, and they did speak to me. I spoke with a nun who worked as a midwife in the biggest mother and baby home in Ireland, and several religious sisters who, you know, remembered these institutions, and they're quite eager to speak. And some did say, you know, what happened was wrong, and but there was still a lot of institutional silence. It you know, beyond the individual women, getting answers from the religious orders was very difficult, even though there were women alive who had been working in these institutions. But, you know, the affidavits to the investigation, the refusal to engage, or to sort of try and give answers, with the media, at least with myself, was just felt like that barrier again, that silence. So it's interesting when that accusation is leveled. Well, what about the other side? Made a huge effort to speak to the other side, but just faced a lot of silence. So this is an extract about a woman that I know personally, and I didn't know had been separated from her son through the institutions in Dublin. And she was sent to one of these families, as many women were. And I remember actually a woman who worked with a sort of organization that was set up for and by so-called unmarried mothers, as they were known, that sort of terrible term. And she remembers just the desperation of trying to find any accommodation, because there, you know, landlords wouldn't take women in if they knew that they were unmarried mothers, and there was so much discrimination, and there was such a lack of economic, you know, independence that was possible, because of the stigma and because of the lack of supports. That sometimes she would place women with these families too, and she remembers families calling and sort of saying, can we get one in for Christmas, you know, as if this was something to have. And many of these women did work when they were there, and several women I spoke to left because of the experiences they had. But I think this is a sort of untold, there's a lot of silence on the part of the families who did sort of, sort of operate within this network. And I think it is an important thing to hear their experience. But this is the experience of one woman who I know. And it's from a chapter called Two Mothers. In November, when she was beginning to show, Bláthnaid was sent to Alia to live with a family in South Dublin. Bláthnaid described the family as jet-setters of the time. She looked after their two young children, did work around the house, sewing for the wife. Bláthnaid had worked as an au pair before, so she had the skills, but she was made to feel like the family was doing her a great favor. When she went out for a walk, she sensed her absence was resented. The family had photos of all the other women they'd had in, clearly proud of doing their Christian duty. One night, only a week or so after Bláthnaid had moved in, they were having a bash, and there were people drinking downstairs. Bláthnaid, in bed, heard snippets of the conversation. I was the topic, she told me. They were laughing about it. Her parents let her come home, where she was hidden away for the remaining months. People who asked were told she was in London. In January, when she went into labour, she was brought to St. Columcille's Hospital in Loughlinstown, rather than one of Dublin's maternity hospitals. A cousin who had adopted a child from Temple Hill gave Bláthnaid the loan of her own wedding ring so that she could pretend to be married. But the matron and the nurses on the ward knew the truth. She was put in a room on her own, not on a normal bed, but a cushioned bench thing, under shelves where they kept spare nappies. She had taken no maternity classes, and no one stayed with her through her labour. After she gave birth, a nurse placed the baby on her tummy. That love, she said, exhaling. It was instant for her and immeasurable. She was kept in the hospital for 10 days because of high blood pressure. The same cousin who lent her the wedding ring then drove her to Temple Hill. She carried her son to the side door and handed him over to the nuns. Many times over the next 3.5 months, she took 2 buses to spend the permitted half hour with her baby. Her mother came with her. She showed me a photo album with shots of her in a blue turtleneck and flared jeans, her hair auburn, holding her son swaddled in a yellow blanket and wearing a yellow baby grow. Her mother is in a tweed coat with a crimson hat on. The wall behind her is pale blue and the carpet an ugly brown paisley. One time she went into the wrong room by mistake and saw the rows of cots, trying to make out if her son was there among them. She always worried how the babies were treated, what her son's life was like when she wasn't there. Even getting the photos developed, I had a feeling of shame, she told me. There was no ring on her finger, no husband beside her. She still thought about ways she might be able to keep her son. If she got married, she thought, her son could be legitimized in the eyes of the church and the state. Before signing the final adoption papers, she met the father again in a pub and gave him a photo of their son. She tried to raise the possibility of getting married, but he didn't absorb it. They were not in love, and it would never have worked. St. Patrick's Guild informed Bláthnaid that her son was going to be adopted, but after months of visits, she couldn't face a final goodbye. She had a small gold medallion with a cross in relief on the front, made especially for her son. The words love and God bless and the year were engraved on the back. She crocheted a blanket for him also and brought a teddy. It was meant to go with him when he was adopted, but he didn't receive it from the Guild until he turned 21. When she went back to the Guild's offices on Haddington Road, over the years, making appointments, she would always bring a small envelope with a donation for the nuns. She had been made to understand when she came to ask, could she have photos of her son or information on how he was doing, that these things cost money. She handed over her money, not large sums, but huge for her at the time. You were begging for information, she said. You were at their mercy. The nuns decided what was written about her in the file and the details her son might one day be given. The nuns held the information on where her son was and with whom. She had signed the adoption order, given up her rights as a mother. After the adoption, she was expected to keep her son's existence a complete secret. So there's just so many women with these same experiences, still searching and still hoping for some information about the children they were separated from. So Blondes is just one story.
Legacies are so difficult to come to terms with. It reminds me of in a poem Van Boland wrote, our future will be the past of other women. Makes me think about, what kind of future we're leaving behind.
I think there's hope. I mean, I think I'm hopeful for Ireland right now, and I think it's been extraordinary to see the changes that have come about in recent years. How do you feel yourself? I mean, over this year, what sort of changes are you hoping to see, or what movements for change do you think we should be more conscious of?
I think I'm quite heartened by the sort of expanded awareness of inclusivity and intersectionality that is beginning to emerge, where people are seeing that vulnerabilities sort of exist across a spectrum of identities, and kind of the more that you're exposed to these different conditions, the more vulnerable you become. So I think there's a groundswell of support, and there's a lot of goodwill behind it, and so I'm also hopeful. But I do think that institutional change in particular takes a long time, and I'm personally just quite an impatient person, so it won't go fast enough. But it reminds me also of a poem by Moya Caelainn, Carrying the Songs, where she uses an epigraph by Irish musician Frank Hart, and he says, "Those in power write the history, those who suffer write the songs." And I feel like, that's one thing that you can never take away from people. You can take away a lot of things, but you can't take away their songs. So there's always hope.
Man, I think those things, we're thinking very conscious of the things that are passed down, and that oral tradition of poetry and of song is something that is always there for us and gives us a sense of the resilience of people throughout the generations. And I think that is one reason why poetry has been so important at this time. Was there another poem that you wanted to read?
I did want to, if I could, read Carrying the Songs by Moya Caelainn. I just think it's really lovely. Carrying the Songs. There was always those with little else to carry, who carried the songs to Babylon, to the Mississippi. Some of these last possessed less than nothing, did not own their own bodies. Yet 3 centuries later, deep rhythms from Africa stowed in their hearts, their bones carry the world's songs. For those who left my county, girls from Downings and the Rosses, who followed herring boats north to Shetland, gutting the sea's silver as they went. Or boys from Ranafast who took the Derry boat, who slept over a rope in a bothy. Songs were their soul's currency, the pure metal of their hearts, to be exchanged for other gold, other songs which rang out true and bright when flung down on the deal boards of their days.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it reminds me of, I was just rereading a poem, and now the poet's name has completely escaped me, but it's the one about how people, it's an Irish saying about how we stand in, in the shelter or in the shade of other people. And it's completely slipped my mind, but I think those experiences of sort of displacement and like connection is really strong at this time, and really important at this time, as we are sort of trying to keep those connections, even while distant and often separated. I was wondering if there's anything you've read the past year or looking forward to reading this coming year, that has been particularly inspiring to you, or something you feel other people should read. And I guess it's a good moment to remind people about, sharing your own work or books that have inspired you as well.
Absolutely. There's lots that I'm looking forward to this year that's coming out, particularly lots of debut books. I might focus on the poets because poetry can never get enough love. So Victoria Kennefic's first collection, Eat or We Both Starve, is coming out. Stephanie Sakia's Amnion with the book. The Yak Dilemma by Supriya Kaur Dhaliwal and Glass by Emily Cooper, which are both coming out with Makina Books. Warsan Shah's first collection, Bless the Daughter Raised by a Voice in Her Head. And I'm also really looking forward to Martina Evans's collection, American Mules, and Tishani Doshi's A God at the Door. Rosalie McDonough's essays, Unsettled, and Emma Dabiri's what White People Can Do. Yeah, just I won't go through them all because I know I want to ask you this question too. So
That's it. This is a brilliant list, and there was definitely two books. I mean, Rosalie McDonough's work. She spoke at this event last year, and I've since then and even before then I've been really excited and anticipating the book that she's bringing out with Skeen. And I mean, I'm excited for your own work with Skeen Press. I think that they do such important work in creating a space for new voices and for stories that really need to be told and need to be heard. So I can't wait to see what you do in your role as editor with them. And I'm excited for Unsettled, for Rosalie McDonough's new work, and Unda Vardoon's book that came out this past year was a real joy to read. But arriving, and I sort of was in my garden, I just got stuck there, sort of leafing through it for ages. Emma Dabiri's work, I think, is incredibly important. We're actually doing a book club with her this Saturday afternoon, if anyone is free, with First Fortnight, which is a festival focused on mental health. So I'm really excited to talk to her about her book Don't Touch My Hair, which I think was incredibly important in the past year that we've had in understanding the experiences of Black people and how those inequalities continue and the injustice continue. But, stories again that have been silenced, I think, parts of Irish history, parts of Irish experience that has been silenced, from the sort of lack of any form of sort of hairdresser that Emma could go to. But I think also that really important point that she makes about the sort of harms of this idea of color blindness, and the reality of racism in Ireland, which I think we're starting to acknowledge, but especially with the recent shooting of George Nikencho and the ongoing protests for justice, I think it's an incredibly important book, and is really, sort of breaking silences around those experiences in Ireland, which, so many people who are Irish mixed race people experience institutionalization in this country, and were sort of denied their Irishness and denied information about their identity. So I'm excited for her new book. I think it's What White People Can Do Next, which I think will be incredibly important as well. And I believe that's coming out this year. It's available for pre-order. So yeah, there's a lot. I think what has moved me and been important this past year as well is a return to the essay by Audre Lorde fairly frequently, the transformation of silence into language and power. And I think that piece particularly speaks about the importance of an intersectional solidarity between women, and sharing experiences, and acknowledging each other, and sharing stories, and having that solidarity and that inclusion of all women and all people, who identify as women, and the strength of that solidarity. So it's and the harm of silence to ourselves as well, when we don't speak our own truth, and we don't write our own truth. So that is definitely something I've returned to quite frequently this past year, and probably will in future. I'm aware of the time, and there's so much we could speak about, but I am conscious that you have a third poem, which I would love to hear. I think it's been a real joy to listen to you read this evening, and this has been just an escape, I think, in many ways, to reflect on everything that's happened this year, but also to celebrate the writing of so many Irish women, and your own. So I think to wrap up, it would be great to hear you read a last poem, if you would.
I will read, but just before that, Caelainn, I was wondering if you wanted to share what stories you're drawn to now, or what you might be working on in the coming year.
Definitely. I think everything will be focused on the report next week coming out, and I think everyone is bracing themselves for that. And we are waiting to hear the results of test excavations at Sean Ross Abbey, where over 1,000 children died, and I think there will be some really important revelations from that report, and it will be very important to listen to survivors over the next, in this time and in the coming year. It's going to be a difficult time, but an important time to have those stories heard and to listen to those voices. I'm following, I think housing is incredibly important. There are so many stories in Ireland to sort of follow when it comes to housing. I think with the pandemic as well, we've seen the insecurity of housing, and the ways that, when there is a political will, that can change. We can have a ban on evictions, we can change policy. And, we speak of direct provision, but emergency accommodation is a similar system of institutionalization that I think needs to be reported on, and stories of and many women with children living in these family hubs and centres, some on the grounds of the religious run institutions. There's a family hub in the former Magdalen Laundry in Hyde Park in Dublin. It's one of the first so-called family hubs. So I think there's so many parallels to sort of interrogate, and those are stories I'll definitely be following in the coming year.
And just on that note also, I wanted to highlight that if you can support a few organisations today, that would be really wonderful. One is Safe Ireland, the national agency working with domestic violence services across the country. We just launched a new campaign to raise awareness about coercive control, particularly as we face into the new lockdown restrictions. And also We Are Here Too, a campaign which is run by the Migrant Women's Collective of Ireland, which assists migrant women who are suffering domestic and gender-based violence. So if you can, please do consider supporting their services.
I actually would say as well that this year, and it slipped my mind before, but this year is importantly the year that our abortion legislation is under review, which is hard to believe. It's been so many years already, and we are at this stage, but I think that's very important. And I think I remember sharing something recently about people still being forced to travel to get healthcare, to get access to abortion, having to travel from Ireland, and people are really surprised. I got so many messages saying, why are people still having to travel? Why is this still a thing? But it very much is. And I mean, following Abortion Support Network and some of the organizations, it's still a significant issue. There are still many people who do not have access to healthcare and to abortion. So that is something this year that I think is important.
Absolutely, and exacerbated by the situation that we're in as well. So much of this is not even possible. So to close, I thought of reading a poem by Caelainn in The Girl Who Married the Reindeer, which is about Women's Christmas, but also about many other things. It's called The Cloister of Bones. I begin from the highest point. Best of all, a bell tower. I see the tops of heads, cobbles, terraces all scuttling down, as if they hunted something, buried between ledges where tables are set in the morning, under plants that grow over walls and pergolas, the slopes of sheds, the stashed pruning shears, under the measured walk of cats. I am searching for a shape, a den, watching for the cloistering blank of a street wall, a dark reticence of windows banked over an inner court, especially roofs arched and bouncing, naves, a corseted apse, and always, even if the chapel sinks deep inside, lit from a common well, I search for hints of doors inside doors, a built-in waiting about of thresholds and washed floors, an avid presence demanding flowers and hush. If I guess right, I hope for a runner of garden, the right length for taking a prayer book for a walk, a small stitching of cemetery ground, strict festivals, an hour for the tremble of women's laughter, corners for mile-high panics, and to find the meaning of the women's Christmas.
Thanks so much. And thanks to everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much for being here. Thanks, Caelainn.
Thank you both so much for this inspirational, thought-provoking, and yet somehow comforting discussion. Happy Nollaig to all of us, and I hope the year ahead is good to us. So that's it, folks. If you enjoyed that and would like to become part of the Irish Writers Centre community, membership is running from January to December now, and by signing up now, you can get plenty of benefits like discounts on writing courses, exclusive access to these videos and information sessions as well. Sign up for our newsletter as well for details of upcoming courses. Thank you all very, very much indeed. Good night.
Thank you and good night.